On the 6th and 7th of April of 1862 occurred the second major battle of the American Civil War, the largest fought in the Mississippi Valley Campaign, and was a sign that what many believed would be a quick conflict would go on to become the bloodiest war in American history. Following two victories at Forts Henry and Donelson, the Union was making steady progress advancing into Confederate territory. As they pushed into the South, Union leadership decided to combine the forces of Ulysses S. Grant and Don Carlos Buell at Pittsburgh Landing, a bank on the Tennessee River 9 miles south of Savannah, Tennessee. 3 miles inland from Pittsburgh Landing stood a log church named Shiloh, the Hebrew word meaning place of peace, which was the structure the battle was named after. The Union's objective was to continue south to Corinth, Mississippi, a strategic railroad intersection and a vital troop and supply conduit for the South. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston, not wanting to wait for Union armies to combine, put his troops into motion towards Pittsburgh Landing from Corinth on April 3rd. Heavy rains delayed the attack until Johnston placed his armies 4 miles south of Pittsburgh Landing at nightfall on April 5th, where pickets from both sides exchanged nervous gunfire throughout the evening. At around 5 a.m. the following morning, fighting began in a cotton field belonging to a farmer, James Fraley, between the small forces of Major James Powell on the Union side and Major Aaron Hardcastle on the Confederate side. Confederate leaders soon heard the commotion in Fraley Field, and General Albert Sidney Johnston ordered a general attack, increasing the number of Confederate forces in the area by several thousand. The Union, likewise, was able to quickly deploy a large number of troops to the area, as well as allowing the rest of the army to prepare for the oncoming attack, partially ruining the Confederate objective of surprising Union forces. Having failed to construct defensive lines or entrenchments, Union forces positioned themselves on a sunken road. It provided them anywhere from a few inches to a few feet of cover, as well as protection in hickory and oak trees. The Confederates there were forced to attack across open ground, making frontal assaults quite difficult. By noon, the Union right had been pushed back substantially, and with an ebb and flow of counterattacks, no forward progress was made. The Union left fared no better into the afternoon, being as well pushed back substantially, though the Confederates, hungry and exhausted of ammunition, pillaged abandoned Union camps instead of continuing the attack. The Union center, the sunken road, was held firmly, repelling multiple Confederate attacks. Around this time, General Albert Sidney Johnston was shot by enemy fire, and blood was dripping from his right leg, though he did not at the time show much concern over the wound. He was soon later seen slumping in his saddle and subsequently bled to death from a torn popliteal artery, and would become the highest-ranking soldier killed in the American Civil War. After the death of Johnston, his second-in-command, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, became the Confederate Army's commander for the rest of the battle. The Confederacy, now under the command of Beauregard, focused heavily on the sunken road. An estimated 8 to 14 infantry charges involving roughly 10,000 Confederate soldiers took place. The fighting there was so intense that it was referred to by soldiers as the Hornet's Nest, due to the buzzing of unending gunfire. Confederates focused all available artillery pieces on the Hornet's Nest, developing the largest concentration of field artillery ever on the North American continent, consisting of over 50 pieces. This barrage of artillery fire proved to be effective, and the Hornet's Nest ultimately fell around 6 o'clock, though not before Grant was able to put in a defensive line. But despite heavy Union losses that day, General Grant showed little concern. Grant was asked if preparation should be made for a retreat, to which he responded, "Retreat? No. I propose we attack at daylight and whip them."
Grant realized that the Confederacy would have to be defeated, and he realized that it was going to cost lives and it was going to be a bloody, terrible struggle. But until the Union was able to kind of impose its will on the Confederacy, the war would probably not end. He also, I know, specifically in the Battle of the Shiloh, the Union was forced to retreat and was pushed back at the first day, and I would assume many people thought that Grant would probably retreat, but instead he led a successful counterattack in the second day, which then basically reversed all of the gains that the Confederacy had made. And so Grant kind of demonstrated that he was, willing to push and attack, and he wasn't someone that was necessarily going to retreat. And I think as you go forward in the Civil War, that's a tactic that the Union was able to just use its superior numbers to kind of grind the Confederacy down, and just they didn't have the soldiers to replace their forces with. And though it gave Grant some people viewed it very negatively that he chose that tactic, but he thought it was the most effective and efficient way to end the war as quickly as possible.
Around this time, Buell's army finally arrived to give the much-needed support for the Union forces. With a worn-out and disorganized army, and unaware of the ongoing resupply with Buell's army, as well as oncoming nightfall, Beauregard called off the attack for the night, believing Grant's army could be easily defeated the next day. Beauregard spent that night in what had been Sherman's tent the night prior, and most of the Confederates had gone to vacated Union camps. He sent a telegram to Richmond, the Confederate capital, calling a premature victory, a belief that was held by the whole of the Confederates involved. Some soldiers even took the loot they had plundered from the Union camps and had begun walking back to Corinth. Heavy rains drenched the battlefield that night, and since most of the Union camps had been captured, soldiers had to sleep in the open with no food or blankets. At that point, Grant had 7,000 soldiers killed, 3,000 more captured, and 10,000 men who were afraid to fight. Before the reinforcements, he had an estimated 18,000 soldiers on his last line. Around midnight, Sherman found Grant resting under a tree. He said to him, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" "Yes," he replied. "Lick 'em tomorrow, though."
I think Grant was in that similar, kind of similar vein of he was not necessarily that successful at school, and but he had a way of motivating, and he was able to kind of see, from what I've read, kind of be able to look at a battlefield and be able to figure out where are the places that we have to defend, where can't we defend, and he was able to kind of be his ability to read complex situations and dynamic situations and make very quick decisions based on imperfect information gave him an advantage of I could look at this battlefield and realize that this is the place that I have to win, this is where I could win, but this is where I'm going to focus my forces. And then, being able, he was, like I said, heavily criticized, but he had a self-confidence that what his tactics were, his strategy in the end would be successful, and that he was able to kind of shun some of the criticism that came his way. And I think part of that was his, there's some letters you can see between him and Lincoln where Lincoln kind of supports him and says, this is kind of, I understand this is the way the war has to go if it's going to eventually end. And I think that, part of that might have been Grant, he didn't grow up with a lot of money. He came from pretty humble backgrounds. And I think he married a pretty wealthy woman from the South, but personally he was not in that. And so maybe that kind of was his, influenced his attitude and how he, had to kind of work for certain things, gave him an appreciation for, the small nuances of looking at battles. And there was, I forget which battle, there was one where they thought basically that the Confederates were going to, I can't remember if they were going to say they're going to attack or retreat, but he was able to just look and see, based on the people they were capturing, it was clearly they were going to retreat. So then he knew that he had to basically attack now or they would all get away. And so that kind of just showed his ability to kind of read a battlefield and make those kind of split decisions to make, the best call with the information that he had.
At 5 o'clock the next morning, the Union began their attack. Steady progress was being made and the Confederacy was being pushed back substantially through the afternoon. And by 1 o'clock, Beauregard had made preparations to withdraw to Corinth, and by 3 the last of the Confederate artillery was hauled away. Grant described the battle as a case of Southern dash against Northern pluck and endurance. The total number of casualties was 23,746, 13,047 for the Union and 10,699 for the Confederates. It was at the time the largest battle ever fought in America. Up to that point, the public held the notion that the war would be short-lived. When news of the bloodshed spread, any hope of a quick war ended.
So I think for the Battle of the Shiloh, there was a couple of important pieces that came from that. One is, it was another attempt or another attack moving north by the South that was eventually defeated. I believe up to that point, it was, if not one of the bloodiest, battles up to that point of the war. It also kind of put General Grant, brought him more national prominence. for winning it, but he also took a lot of blame for being caught in the first day of the battle. It was a surprise attack by the Confederate forces, and Grant, I think, also suffered more casualties, even though in the end it is sort of a tactical Union victory. And so it kind of foreshadowed the future of the war, where the Union was going to have to kind of grind the Confederacy down. And Grant's tactics, while eventually successful, he also faced a lot of criticism in the North for not being prepared and suffering and the amount of loss of life that came with it.
After Shiloh, the leadership knew that this was just the beginning of a war that would cost many lives. And in all, the death count would rise to over 620,000, the deadliest conflict in American history.